And like I said, I have a version of this that I have modified, and I actually present to students in the school as well. And I use this same title here, Stop and Listen, right? Encouraging our young people to slow down as they're rushing from class to class or activity to activity, or scrolling through social media on their phones, or whatever it is. Encouraging not just our teachers and our staff and our faculty to slow down, but also our young people as well. So I would encourage you to start to ask yourself that question. Do you have the bandwidth, some of the mental space, the mental capacity to slow down a little bit, and to begin to listen to the students that you see in front of you in really meaningful ways, as we talk about how to address the issue of suicide in our schools. Okay, click through here. Okay. So first thing first, this work is not meant to be done alone. And I mean that in a few ways. The first thing is this. Even as a counselor, many of my colleagues and friends are counselors. We know in that field that we need support, that we need our own sounding boards. We need people that when we are struggling that we can go to, and we need people that have our backs when things can get tricky, right? So this work of addressing the issue of suicide, the concern of suicide in the lives of our students, is not something that we can do alone. So I do not by any means want you to walk away from our conversation here today thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this is, I'm the only one from the school, or there are only a handful of us from our school, so this is on my shoulders to do this work. I'd really like you to start considering who are the people that you can bring alongside you in this, whether those are other folks in the school, other teachers, administrators, faculty, counselors, whoever it may be, as well as the community resources that are available in your area. This work is not meant to be done alone, and a primary piece of any caring that we give is the necessity that we care for ourselves along the way. So that's the first thing, right? I said this is, I mean this in a couple different ways. The first way is that we need to identify and be aware of the supports that the people and the resources that are supportive to us as we do this work of caring for people, caring for young people as they struggle with the idea of suicide. The second way that I mean it is quite scriptural, right? One of the very last things, depending on which gospel you're looking at, one of the very last things that Jesus says to his disciples is this here toward the end of Matthew 28. Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an important piece to be reminded of as we walk through this as well. I will talk a little bit more in a few minutes. How one of the
I can't hear anything.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you just entered in, you need to click on the interpretation globe and select your language, English or Spanish.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Ken. Some of the last words of Jesus before he ascends to heaven, surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. And we'll talk more in a few minutes. But one of the primary issues that we see, one of the primary commonalities, I'll say, that we see in people, young people, adults, whoever it may be, who are struggling with suicidal desperation or suicidal thinking or suicidal ideology, is this feeling of being alone, this feeling of being uncared for, this feeling of feeling isolated, right? So not only is this message from Jesus important to us as caregivers, But this is something that can be really important to those who might be at risk as well. It's this reminder that we are not alone as we do this work. So as we step into these difficult places and difficult conversations, remember to invite Christ into that, invite the Holy Spirit into that presence and into that space as well. So our hope for today is that we move towards an honest conversation about suicide. Our experience, and I don't want to speak too closely for Michelle, but I'll say for me, my experience, whether it's on a personal, anecdotal with friends, family, and loved ones that I am close with, or whether this is on a professional level, working with people in counseling, working with people in consulting, working with different churches and schools, my experience tells me that suicide is a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people. People would rather skirt the topic and are uncomfortable to talk about it. And oftentimes when they do talk about it, will speak sort of vaguely, kind of beat around the bush, walk very tentatively through the conversation. So the hope today is that we can kind of push back against that tendency that honestly, I think we all have. It is a difficult conversation. So we're going to push back on that tendency a little bit and move into this space of honesty. So some of the reasons that this conversation about suicide can be uncomfortable and often does go unmentioned. One of the first ones is stigma. And if you ask a room full of people why it's hard to talk about suicide or mental health issues, this is often one of the first things that comes up. And I think that it's particularly true in faith-based contexts. There are plenty of different views and opinions about what scripture might have to say about suicide, or what our faith might, how our faith might inform us in terms of conversations regarding suicide and mental health. But I would say that particularly in faith-based contexts, this notion of stigma can be pretty powerful. I've only started to formulate this thought over the last couple months, so it's sort of a new thing. But what I've realized, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different churches and a lot of different ministries and a lot of different ministry leaders. And one of the issues that I think the church is bumping into, or one of the issues that the church might even be causing in some of this, is whether it's happening intentionally or accidentally. Oftentimes we communicate the idea that joy is the only permissible emotion. We see in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 5, it says something like, be joyful in all circumstances, prayerful in all situations, something along those lines. And I think the way that gets interpreted sometimes is, well, boy, if I'm having a difficult time, then it must be an issue of faith. If I'm struggling with mental health, it must be an issue of faith. If I'm concerned about suicide, it must be an issue of faith. When honestly, quite the opposite is often true. If you look at the life of Jesus that we see mapped out in the Gospels, all of the universal emotions, we can find them and identify them in the life of Jesus. We see joy, we see connection, right? All those things, but we also see pain and grief and sadness and sorrow, to the point in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, I'm overwhelmed. My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death, right? So we see even this great pain in the life of Jesus as well. So some of the reason that suicide goes unmentioned is this idea of stigma, right? And I think some of that oftentimes has to do with the way that we've communicated whether or not it's quote unquote okay to struggle as people of faith. And I would I would strongly argue, yes, of course it's okay to struggle, right? Yes, it's okay. Of course it's okay to have those difficult conversations. It's a very common piece of our human experience, and we see that in the life of Jesus as well. So then connected to that is this idea of shame, right? If there is a stigma around mental health, if there is a stigma around conversations regarding suicide, which I would argue there is a stigma, those that are in that place might feel a sense of shame. I am working with a client right now who has struggled with suicidal ideology in her life. And she has worked through that and has gotten to some very healthy places. But she routinely, when she faces difficulty, when something goes, when something doesn't play out quite perfectly, she often talks about shame and embarrassment, right? That she couldn't overcome this, that she's still struggling, right? So for people that have a history of mental health concerns or suicidal ideology, this idea of shame rises to the surface and oftentimes, again, goes unmentioned. It's easier to not talk about it, is the sense. Connected to that is fear, right? And this plays out from a few different angles as well. Suicide is often unmentioned due to fear because we don't know how people will react. If I'm already feeling disconnected, if I'm already feeling isolated and I've lost some of my social networks, or they've not been supportive in the way that I need them to be, it's quite reasonable for me to be concerned if I were to share with them my suicidal thinking. Boy, I'm not sure that they would actually be supportive. I'm not sure that they would actually care for me in the way that I need to. Right, so will sharing this make things even worse, right? So there's fear from that standpoint. And on the other standpoint, from the caregiver's viewpoint, maybe if you're a teacher or a faculty member at your school, there's fear of bringing, if you were to see a student who you were concerned about, there might be fear of getting involved. There might be fear of how a parent would react. There might be a fear of how the student would react. There is a very common question of, if I get into this, if I start this conversation, will I be able to handle the outcome? Will I know what to do next, right? So fear is a very common experience in this as well. And then the last one that I've alluded to throughout each of these is disconnection from one another and support, right? I said before, one of the commonalities that we see in so many people who are struggling with suicidal thinking is this feeling of being disconnected, isolated, and separated from social supports. And so, sort of just very practically speaking, if I'm disconnected from social supports, I might not have anybody to talk to, or I might feel like I don't have anybody to talk to. And if I'm disconnected from those social supports or even resources in the community or in the school, if I don't know where to turn, then this may be something that I end up just carrying on my own. So all sorts of the reasons why this concept of suicide, this idea of suicide, often goes untalked about. So thinking about that idea of our disconnection from one another, I want to open broaden is probably a better term. I want to broaden our view of what it means to be sort of connected to this idea of suicide. I think sometimes very well-meaning parents, caregivers, counselors, teachers, whoever it may be, will think to themselves, well, I've never considered suicide. I don't know people who really struggled with it. So I've got no connection, right? I'm not sure how I would even help. I don't know anything about it, right? But even that is a perspective, right? Even that is, that may provide some important insight, and you're not alone in that. So students and staff alike may have one of these 5 connections to this idea of suicide. There are going to be students in your schools. There are going to be staff in your schools. It may be your story. You might be someone who has never seriously considered suicide. And again, there are going to be students in your classes and in your hallways that feel that way. The people that have never seriously considered suicide. One of the things that I've noticed in the lives of young people is some difficulty differentiating between thinking about suicide, having thoughts about suicide, and considering suicide. I would say that as a young person, when I was in middle school and high school, there were times when I had thoughts about suicide. What would that be like? How would people react? What would that situation look like in my life? But I never seriously considered suicide. It never felt like something that was an option, a real option for me. So when I say considering suicide, what I mean, and this will come up throughout our conversation, is if you, in my terminology, if someone is considering suicide, suicide is an option for them. It's an option in their thinking. And I think for young people, there's oftentimes some fear that comes up of, I've had thoughts about suicide. Does that mean that I am suicidal, right? And if they've got someone to talk that through with, there's so much space that we can be supportive in even just those very early stages where someone might be struggling. So again, you may have people who are in that space that they've never seriously considered suicide. We've also got people, moving on to the second tab here, who might be concerned for someone who is at risk or may be at risk of suicide. Perhaps you've had the experience of having a student come up to you and this student is worried, not for their own well-being, but for the well-being of one of their friends. And again, that's a pretty common experience as well. If you think of people, students or staff, again, in the network of the school, they might have, a teammate, they might have a classmate, they might have someone that's in the drama club with them, whatever it may be, that's noticed that this person is struggling. And when you're in a social environment like a school, oftentimes that pain is noticed by others, right? So there may be situations where you've got someone who is not worried for their own well-being, but is worried for somebody else. Moving down that tab, may have students and staff that have lost someone to suicide. They were friends with somebody, it might be a family member, it might be a classmate. I'm not sure. I recognize that there's a lot of different schools represented on today's call. So I don't know the details of each of those schools by any means. But you may have people in your class or in your schools that have died by suicide. And that impacts teachers, that impacts families, that impacts students. So again, that ripples out and it's a common experience as well. As we walk through this, I'll share some statistics with you in a few minutes. You'll see that there are plenty of young people who might have current thoughts of suicide. And while they may on the surface appear to be going through their day, just as any other student, they may be carrying the weight of that suicidal thinking with them. And then lastly, there may be people who have seriously considered suicide at one point, but that's just not a piece of their story anymore. Whether they were able to find supports internally or externally, whether a circumstance changed, whether they were able to develop different coping skills or coping mechanisms. For some reason, they've moved past that moment and they are now in a different space of life. So when I say that I wanted to broaden our perspective of how we connect with this idea of suicide, if there are those of you on this call who are thinking like, I don't really have a connection to suicide, I don't know much about it, my guess is you can find yourself in at least one of these places, if not two or three places on this list. And so the idea is, the reason I want to share all that is to say that your experience is valued. Your experience is valuable, and the insights that you have to share in this conversation, whether it's literally the conversation we're having today, or the ways that you care for young people around you. there's value to those insights as well. So don't discount your experience in this conversation. I'm glad that you're here and you've got some wisdom to share. So as we're talking about suicide, this may seem basic, right? This may seem very basic, but I do think it's important to just make sure we're sort of on the same page. Again, I told you I have a modified version of this conversation that I present to students, and I think this is especially important to talk about with young people. There's an author, I don't know if all of you will be familiar with this author, but her name is Brené Brown. And Brené Brown has a quote. She says, "To be clear is to be kind." So in this conversation, as we're speaking about talking honestly about suicide, I think it's important to be clear. There is kindness in being clear. So when we say suicide, what are we saying? And this comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Their definition of suicide is this. Suicide is a death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. So this isn't accidental. This is not unintentional. This isn't somebody else did this to me. This is a self-directed, injurious behavior with the intent to die. And then it starts with that word death, right? So when we talk about suicide, I do think it's important, again, to be clear about, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? So according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and this is a helpful definition for me, suicide is a death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with an intent to die as a result of the behavior. Let's talk a little bit more about what it is and how it impacts the people around us. So all of these statistics, I'm not sure where everybody is from, but I gather by the different time zones on the call that we're not all from the United States. So some of these statistics may not be exactly lined up with your communities and your parts of the world. But I think, again, there's insight and information in them nonetheless. So to be clear, each of these statistics that I'll share over the coming slides are in regard to youth and adolescents and young people in the United States. So whether or not you find yourself in the United States today, I hope that there's some insight that you can see in these statistics as well. If you're wondering to yourself, why are these stats from 2019 and 2020? I think there might be some from a little bit more recent as we go on. If you're wondering to yourself, why don't we have stats from more recent years? The answer is sort of unfortunate, but also pretty easy. It's because these statistics are gathered on a national scale, and it usually takes them about a year or two. It usually takes these organizations about a year or two to gather all of the information into one place. So the most recent statistics that we have regarding, in the United States, the most recent statistics that we have regarding national suicide rates on these very grand levels. There is newer information from smaller research studies, but the grand, large-scale national studies are always a few years behind. But I'll show you some trends in just a moment that I think will help to shine a light on where things might be going in today's world as well. So in 2019, in the United States, 18.8, so almost 19% of high school students self-reported that they seriously considered suicide. So about 19% of students, high school students in the United States reported that at some point in that year, they seriously considered suicide. Now, remember the language that I used earlier. This isn't just having thoughts about suicide. This isn't just thinking about it. This is, they seriously considered suicide. So that means it was a serious option. It felt like a real option for them at some point in that year. So about 19%, about 4 out of 20 high school students consider suicide as an option for their life in any given year. moving a little bit more recently, in the year 2020, suicide was the second leading killer of anyone ages 10 to 14, and the third leading killer of anyone ages 15 to 24. Just sort of some information for your own understanding. Again, in the United States, the top three things that kill young people in our country, and the way these age brackets are broken down, I define young people as anyone ages 10 to 34. So it's a pretty broad group. Anyone ages 10 to 34, the top three things are always the same. The first thing is almost always unintentional accidents. Accidents are killing our young people. And then second and third place often change. Every couple years, second and third place, the second and third killing, the second and third leading killer of young people will switch. And those two things are either suicide or homicide. And so what that means to me is this. If the top three things killing young people ages 10 to 34 in the United States are accidents, suicide, and homicide, for the most part, the things that are killing our young people are preventable. We can do something about it. So let me take a moment here and say thank you to each of you caring for the young people in your communities, caring for the students, caring for their families in good times and in bad. The work that you do is important and meaningful, and I'm convinced that it's saving lives on a day-to-day basis. So we see here over the last few years, about 4 out of 20 high school students in any given year will consider suicide, seriously consider suicide. And it is, depending on the age bracket, either the second or third leading killer of young people in the United States today. Every year these numbers change just a little bit, but history tells us that it's in the United States about 45. It's right around 45,000 people. Excuse me, right around 45,000 people every year die from suicide. Most recent numbers in 2020 are a little higher than 45,000, but again, it's right in that ballpark. And when you do the simple math and divide 45,000 by 365 days a year, it comes out to, I think it's 123.2. So it's about 123 people are dying by suicide in the United States every day. So again, when we start to think about who is impacted by suicide, the number of people that are impacted by it, how they are impacted by it, we can see that this ripple effect goes out and out from here. Michelle, I can't see the chat, but I've seen that a bunch of things have gone in. Is there anything that we need to touch on before I keep rolling here?
Yeah, there was just a question. You probably pretty much addressed it about 2020 numbers compared to pre-COVID numbers compared to post-COVID numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, let me see. I will talk a little bit more about post-COVID numbers in a moment. What we do have is, again, on a smaller scale, and we know by again, this is more local information than it is national or global. But we know that emergency room visits due to mental health concerns are up. We know that emergency room visits due to suicide attempts are up. We know that crisis calls in the lives of young people are up as well. So things post-COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID, things do seem to be ticking in a concerning direction. I'll share, I think it's the next slide after this one. I've got something that kind of shows a trend over the last decade or so of how that's moving. And I think we can make some guesses as to where things might be going based on those trends and what we know on, again, more local scales anecdotally from post-COVID as well.
But I would like, Ed, to just sort of insert, I'm not even sure I know this, but I think there's a question about the number of calls to the call center, the number of visits to the ER, and whether that's good news because people know help is available, or whether that's an indication that more people are experiencing suicidality than they were before.
Yeah. So
I don't think we know that, but I think it's
don't.
an interesting question.
Yeah, we don't. This is I'll say it now and I'll expand on it a little bit later. I've gotten on a bit of a, it's not a soapbox. I've tried to keep it from becoming a soapbox. But for the last 2 years, as we've all walked through this pandemic together, people know that I work in mental health. People know that I work with young people. And so I often get the question, boy, this has been really hard on our students. Boy, this has been really hard on our youth, hasn't it? And I would completely agree with you, Michelle. We don't really know yet. My stock answer has been, give me 5 to 10 years and then I'll be able to tell you, right? I think we really need to get some space away from, we're still sort of in the thick of it, right? I think we need to get some space before we're going to be able to really unpack what's going on. And I'm presenting at a conference in a couple weeks, and sort of a crux of that, of what my co-presenter and I are presenting is, have numbers gotten worse? Yes, period. From what we know, the statistics and the numbers have gotten worse, but they've gotten worse at almost the exact same rate that they did all of the other years previously. So we don't really know, to your point, Michelle, we don't really know if COVID made things worse or if the trend has always been there. So I hope that sort of answers the question and opens that up a little bit too.
Yeah.
Okay. A little bit more about the impact. I've said a couple times how this suicide, when it does occur, whether it occurs or whether it's someone considering, I've talked about how that effect ripples out beyond just that person. It's estimated that every suicide that happens touches about 147 people. For those of you that work in a school, my guess is that's not hard for you to imagine. I don't know the size of your schools. I have family members that go to very small private schools, and there might be 147 people in the entire school. I myself went to a high school that had a graduating class of close to 500 people. So I've worked with and sort of familiar with districts and schools of all sorts of different sizes. But if you can imagine a suicide happening in a family or a suicide happening to a student in a school, it's not hard to imagine the number of other students or family members or classmates or teammates or community members or neighbors, whoever it might be, that are impacted by that. And again, just simple math, when you take that about 45,000 suicides per year, and it's estimated that every one of those suicide touches about 147 people, those numbers round out to about 6 million people every year are closely touched by suicide. And those are no small numbers. Again, we can see the ripple effect of this moving out into our communities, into our families, and into our schools. And we also know that people that are exposed to suicide in unhealthy ways or unsafe ways, risk goes up for each of those people as well. So again, it's calls our attention to the necessity for conversations like this, calls our attention to the need to care for young people and families who might be walking through these difficult times as well. So here's the slide that I've been alluding to. Sorry, I got to move my windows out of the way here. This is the slide I've been alluding to over the last little bit of our conversation about the trends that we see. Every 2 years, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, perform a national survey with tens of thousands of students, high school students, and they call it the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The information, the entire survey, the results of the entire survey are distilled in very readable format and are available on the CDC's website. If you simply type Youth Risk Behavior Survey into a search browser, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. and they research topics regarding suicide, mental health, sexual activity, LGBTQ plus concerns, drug use, and several other things. A very interesting report that comes out every 2 years. I'm expecting, you can see here, they do this report every 2 years. I'm expecting that the 2021 report will be out hopefully soon. I don't know if how the pandemic has affected their research in terms of whether or not they did it, or to what degree, or to what scale they did the research. But I would expect that the newest report would be coming out shortly. They usually come out about a year after the research begins. So with that in mind, at the very beginning of the 2019 report, which was released in 2020, there was a section on COVID-19. And in that section, they said, we recognize that this report was done before the coronavirus pandemic. So this information, they are explicit, does not address the COVID-19 pandemic, even though the report was released in 2020. The most recent information that we have from this Youth Risk Behavior Survey is from 2019. So what I'd like to point out here is the trend. So if you can see my mouse on the far right side here, they have three symbols. This Youth Risk Behavior Survey has three symbols: a green light, which means things are getting better; a yellow light, which means things are stayed about the same; and a red sort of hexagon or octagon sort of stop sign shape. That means things are getting worse. This is moving in a negative direction. And you can see for 4 of the 5 here, the trend has gone in the wrong direction, with the exception of 1, and that one stayed just about the same. So when you look at again, these are high school students in the United States, what these young people are dealing with. In 2019, about 18.8, this is the number we shared earlier, about 18.8% of high school students seriously considered suicide. That's up from 17.2. And you'll note that in 2017, that's just about the only place that you can see the numbers ticked down. The trend got a little bit better in these 4 areas than in the previous years. But follow that back, right? So 18.8, so we're at 18, 17, lower 17, 15, 13, right? These numbers are trending up. The percentage of students who seriously considered suicide in any given year. So to the question in the chat, and Michelle, what you had alluded to, are the numbers worse? It seems our current numbers of suicide rates and ER visits for mental health reasons, do the numbers seem to be higher? Yes, they do. They do seem to be higher currently. We don't quite know why. And B, I would contend, and what I have seen, is that they are increasing at the same rate that they have in each of these previous years. There was a survey that was done. I don't have the stats in front of me right now. There was a survey that was done, I believe mid last year, that was specifically talking to middle school and high school students about the impact of the pandemic on their mental health. Interestingly, about 48% of students said it got worse, that their mental health got worse, and about 48% of students said that it actually got better. So I would say, in the question of how has the pandemic affected the mental health of our young people? It depends on the young person. And I know that is a sort of an unsatisfying answer. But in my experience and with the information that we have right now, it really sort of depends on the on the specific situation that young person was in. I worked with high school students as counseling clients through the pandemic, some of which reported to me that they actually liked the pandemic better than previous times of life, just because of the ways that they felt more comfortable at home. They were more able to connect with family in some ways. And of course, that's not everyone's situation. But for some people, Again, it just sort of depends on the unique situations, right? And so in those places, my reminder to you, people that work with young people on a day-to-day basis, the term that a friend and I have started to use is yield to youth, right? We can't assume that our young people are struggling just because anecdotally we know this has been a hard time. We also can't assume that because this young person has resources and healthy supports in their life that they're doing well, right? The only way we can really know what the impact of the pandemic has been on the young people in our communities is when we yield to youth. And really, again, it's where we started this conversation. Stop and listen, right? We need to slow ourselves down, kind of get off of our own stories and our own understanding sometime, and listen to the stories of young people. So again, we see that the trends are moving in this direction, and in terms of where are things moving post-COVID, we're not exactly sure yet. My guess is things are continuing to move along that trend there. Okay. Any questions about that information? Because I know that it's connected to the question that we had before. I think I saw one more thing come in the chat. Okay, keep moving. If I can get it to go. Okay. So we know what suicide is. We talked about it. It's a death caused by self-injurious behavior with an intent to die. We can see where the trends are going. We have an understanding of the number of people that are impacted. Let's talk a little bit about what it's not, because I think there are plenty of misconceptions about suicide out there as well. You can see right here, it's not a new concern. That's what we've been talking about. So many people, what I have said is a hunch of mine. I'm not willing to make a hypothesis yet, but a hunch of mine is that what the pandemic served to do is shine a spotlight on concerns that were already there. Mental health concerns were already present in our communities. For those of you that work with young people, you probably know that. Issues of and concern regarding suicide was already there. And what the pandemic did was serve to shine a spotlight on that. So more and more people are seeing that. And that might be a good thing. That might be a good thing that people are being able to see that more and able to reach out for help in more timely and appropriate ways. So first thing, it's not a new concern. Second thing, it's not crazy. If you've walked through a period of suicidal thinking in your own life, or with somebody who is in a period of suicidal thinking, and you've taken time again to stop and listen to their story, time and time again, what my experience is that I hear this story, I hear this young person's story, or I hear this adult story, and there's a piece of me that goes, man, that really does sound hard. I can see why this entered your story. I can see why this entered into your life as an option. And one of the best ways that I've heard that described is something like this, right? It's often the case that people who are considering suicide, it's often the case that they don't necessarily want to die. They just don't want life to be like it is, right? They don't want to live with life like this, right? And when we take the time to stop and listen to those stories, we can understand, yeah, I wouldn't want life to be like that either. Is there a way that we can help find a different kind of life? Is there a way that we can find different supports, right? So suicide is not a crazy thought, right? If you take time to stop and listen, you can hear the pain that comes with the weight of suicidal thinking. It's not selfish. There is a phrase that sometimes gets thrown around when we talk about people who might be struggling with suicide, and people will incorrectly say you're only thinking of yourself, or they're not thinking of anybody but themselves. And more honestly than that, it's not that they have chosen to not think about anybody else, chosen to not care about anybody else. Again, it's more often the case that this person doesn't feel that anybody cares for them. It's not that they don't care for other people. It's that they feel other people don't care for them. So suicidal thinking is not selfish, right? It's often, again, goes back to that loss of connection, that loss of hope, those loss of social supports. And it's also not unstoppable. We know that honest conversations about suicide can save lives. We know that when we take the time to stop and listen to young people's stories, that we can become the support that they didn't know that they had, right? So we can step into those dark and difficult places and provide support in those places. So no, it's not unstoppable. It's not a new concern. It's not crazy. It's not selfish, and it's not unstoppable. So if that's true, if it's not unstoppable, then the next reasonable question is, okay, so then what can I do about it? That's where we're going to spend the rest of our time, is just walking through what can I do about it. And so I've got it broken down into these just 3 kind of chunks. The first thing is become aware, right? And that's what we're doing right now. We're becoming aware of the prevalence of suicide. We're becoming aware of the different rates and the trends regarding suicide. So that's on sort of a large scale, but I also mean it as in terms of become aware of the needs in your community. Become aware of the supports in your community. Become aware of the young people, your students who might be struggling. So first thing is we need to become aware. Excuse me. Second thing is we need to care. We need to make a choice to intentionally care. I love in scripture the phrase, clothe yourselves with love. There's something so intentional about that, right? When we wake up in the morning and we clothe ourselves, we've made a choice about what we're wearing. There's intent behind it and there's purpose behind it. And we choose those things and we put them on, right? And so when we choose to clothe ourselves with love, it's a reminder that we need to choose to care. And Isaiah 61 is Isaiah giving name to, articulating this call of the Lord on his life. He says things like to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to shine a light in the darkness, to bind up the brokenhearted, right? And again, it's those places where Isaiah is saying, these are the places where I am called to care. These are the people that I am called to serve. And it's the brokenhearted, it's the imprisoned, it's those that feel trapped and in darkness, right? So we can become aware first, then we can make that choice to care in those dark places. And then the last thing here that we'll talk about as we go is we can help others become aware. This is such an important part of this. I started with the slide that said first things first, right? We are not meant to do this work alone. So if you were to, hop off this call and go back to your schools or go back to your classes or wherever it may be, and find all of the resources in your community that can serve those that are struggling with mental health needs, and find all of the resources in your community that can support those that are struggling with suicidal thinking. But if you were the only person that did that, man, that would be such a huge weight for you to carry, right? You're not meant to do this work alone. So a primary piece of this is also helping others become aware. So let's talk about that becoming aware part of this. I spoke in preparation for our conversation today. I reached out to a friend of mine who works at a local school district. And she works as sort of a mental health and counseling liaison across each of the different schools, each of the different grade level schools in her school district. So she spends time in the elementary schools with very young students all the way up through middle and high school. So she spends time on a weekly basis with students in grades, or ages 6 all the way up to 18. And I said to her, hey, I'm speaking to a group of people who work in schools. What's something that I need to talk about? And she said the first thing that came to her mind was this. She said, people that work in schools need to know what the available resources are. And what I mean by that is, what she meant by that was both in-school resources and community-wide. So who are the people in your particular school? Again, I know we have folks from all over the world here, and obviously several different settings, but who are the people that can give appropriate care in your school? Do you have counselors that are trained for this sort of thing? Are you the counselor there? In the United States, I think most, if not all, public schools have what is called a student support team. And it's a group of teachers, administrators, and counselors who gather together on a weekly basis to talk about issues that may have arisen in the week or in the past weeks or in the lives of their students, whether that's something going on in family, whether that's something going on academically. And then not only just talk about what some of those can, not only talk about what some of those concerns are, but talk about ways that they can support those students and young people as well. So if you're unsure of who those people are in your school, or if your school doesn't have that organized system, I would highly recommend that you become familiar with who those people are, who those supports are, and what that chain of command looks like for how we provide support for the young people in our community and in your schools. If you just sort of on a general sociological level, humans, all of us, every single one of us, has a tendency from time to time to think to ourselves, somebody else will take care of it. I don't need to deal with it. Somebody else will take care of it. And if we are constantly and continually waiting for someone else to take care of a hurting young person, there's a real risk that that young person is going to go unsupported. So a primary piece of why we think to ourselves, someone else will handle it, is we think, well, I wouldn't know what to do anyways. I wouldn't know who to go to. I wouldn't know what to say. So become aware of those resources in your school and in your community. So if there is a young person struggling, you can connect them with the necessary resources. Connected to that is knowing the signs of suicidal thinking. So this next slide here, I actually went on a local school's website and just took a screenshot. I kind of copy and pasted this directly from a local school district's website. And this is on this, this district's one of the primary pages on how they care for the young people in their community. And the encouragement that's, sort of on the rest of this team, on the rest of this page, if you can see, I'm trying to move some things out of the way here. If you see up here, it says, what might be a reason to refer someone to the FACT team? This is from a school district called Freeport Area. So that's what the FA is. So this is their acronym for Freeport Area Care Team, is what they have called their student support. So they're saying, what might be a reason to refer someone to this FACT team, right? And then they have this list of potential signs, right? So whether it's a change in behavior or mood, a drop in grades or performance, change in friends or appearance, physical systems health problems, defiance of rules at home or at school, I think that's important. Alcohol and drug use, whether they are bullying someone or being bullied, if they're expressing, whether it's through their behavior or through their words or through other means, if they're expressing hopelessness or worthlessness. If we see some of those mental health issues start to arise, depression and anxiety, different family dynamics, and then personal stressors, whether they're moving or a loss of a family member, whatever it may be. This school district has said, if you see these things arise in the life of a young person in your community, they say, refer it to the support team. These are some signs of potential suicidal thinking. It doesn't mean that every kid who gets a bad grade is thinking about suicide. It doesn't mean that every kid who is being bullied is thinking or considering suicide, but these are some potential warning signs. And this school district's encouragement was, if this happens, whether you are a teacher, and this is available to teachers and parents and students alike, so across the board, faculty, staff, parents, and students are able to make these referrals. And their encouragement is, if you see any of these signs in a young person, refer it to the support team. And the support team can do the work on trying to figure out, do we need to provide greater resources? So thinking about that idea of becoming aware and then making a choice to care, first thing here is become aware of what we can look for, right? What are some of the signs and symptoms that we might see in our young people? This is a really good list here. These are some of the signs and symptoms we might see in young people who are considering suicide. And then making the choice to care would be saying, I'm gonna reach out to this person, or if there's a support team, I'm gonna reach out to the support team and they can connect with this young person. And when I was talking with my colleague who works in the schools, she said, 5 referrals are better than no referrals, which I thought was a good line. She's saying, I'd rather have 5 people tell me about one kid who might be struggling, even if it's just a small thing, than no people tell me about a kid who might be struggling, even if it's just a small thing. So if you know who those resources are in your community, if you know what to look for, we can start to provide care for the young people in our schools. Okay. Second thing, talked about becoming aware. What are the resources in our areas? How can we build those resources if they don't already exist? How can you build a support team? And then how do we move on to this next step? How do we care, right? I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is really informative here. Parable of the Good Samaritan, we see the priest and the Levite walk by this man who has been beaten and abused and robbed, and for all intents and purposes left to die. We get this sense, whether it be a matter of ritual cleanliness, whether it be a matter of they just think they have quote unquote more important things to do, that this priest and this Levite have chosen convenience, right? They think to themselves, I don't have the time to deal with this. This is not my job to do. Someone else will take care of this, right? And then we have the Samaritan come along. And yes, let's be honest. When the Samaritan comes along to care for this hurting person, it sort of gets in the way of this person's day. I don't know what the Samaritan had planned for the rest of that day, but it says he puts him on his own donkey. He takes him to an inn. He pays for his stay, right? This isn't a convenient moment for this Good Samaritan here, but he chose to care, right? He chose safety of this person who was hurting over convenience. Again, it's that encouragement that I've repeated throughout. We need to stop and listen. We need to slow down. I understand, again, I said that there's not an abundance of time in the life of a teacher or a school faculty member. But if we see a young person hurting, or if we see a young person who might be hurting, displaying one of those signs or symptoms, then we need to make the choice to choose safety over convenience in those times. And then people always ask, okay, well, if I go and I go talk to someone who might be hurting, what do I do? What do I say, right? And the answer is quite simple. Again, what we've been repeating, stop and listen. We listen, right? We choose to listen, not to solve the problem. In James 1:19, it says this, be quick to listen and slow to speak. And that is deep wisdom in all of our lives, especially when we're caring for hurting people, right? We need to choose to listen to their story. I told you earlier that when I have taken the time to listen to the story of people who are struggling and hurting and might be considering suicide, I often find myself with new insights and new understanding and new connection to that person. So simply inviting those people to share what might be, that young person to share what might be going on in their life that day, what might be the struggles of that moment, and then inviting them to share that story, and you simply taking a back seat to listen in that place. Remember, we yield to youth. Right? We allow them the space to share. Be clear and compassionate. At Soul Shop, we make a very intentional point about using the word suicide in particular. I said earlier that The hope was that we would be able to have an honest conversation. And for the reasons of stigma and shame and fear and all those things, we often end up beating around the bush and not speaking directly or clearly about suicide. So we say things like, are you going to do something drastic? And are you thinking about hurting yourself, right? But there's a lot of, that's very vague, and there can be some confusion and lack of clarity there. So we encourage you to talk to people if you recognize that someone is in this hurting space and might be considering suicide. We encourage you to ask a question that is clear and compassionate. Boy, does it ever get so hard that you start to think about suicide? That's one of the ways that I've come to really appreciate. Does it ever get so hard that you begin to think about suicide, right? It's clear and it's compassionate, right? And we have to make that choice, right? For the reasons we talked about, stigma, shame, fear, and others. It can be hard to ask those direct questions, but we know that those questions can save lives. So be clear and compassionate as you walk into this space of caring. And last on this slide, and of primary importance, however, is we need to know our own boundaries. If you are working with a young person who is going through something that is similar to what you might have gone through in your life, it might be very hard to hear that story. It might be a very difficult space for you to care for that person if you've not been able to process that on your own. So we need to know some of our own boundaries of what can we talk about? How much care do I have to give? So some of that is personal, but some of it's also professional. I'm not sure, again, what all of your roles are in the school, but whether you're on custodial staff, whether you're a counselor, whether you are a teacher, whether you are an administrator, we need to know what our professional roles or our professional boundaries are, and when it's okay and necessary to say, you know, we need to find somebody else to help be a support in this conversation as well, right? Again, we're not meant to do this work alone. So we need to be able to know when to bring in extra support for these young people as well as for ourselves. And then the last little stop on this conversation, what can I do about it? Help others become aware. Looks like, sorry, I think the words help others got cut off there on the top. We can help others become aware. So this is not just the job for staff, right? We need to equip students, parents, and all faculty, right? So this is not just a job for just the teachers or just the counselors, or just the administrators, just the staff, however, right? You all know, you work with young people on a day-to-day basis. They oftentimes know more about each other's lives than we do. So we need to equip our young people to know what the signs and the symptoms are. We need to equip our students and our young people to know what resources they can help their friends find. If you do have a support team in your school, and I really hope that you do your students know who are the people on that support team? Some of the ways that you can do that. Some school districts choose to have electronic referral forms. They've got things loaded on, whether if you're familiar with or if you use Google Docs and Google Forms. They're forms that are available on their website, and students and parents can access those 24 hours a day to make referrals about someone that might be struggling, a student or a peer that might be struggling. I know of school districts that all members of the support team, whether it be, again, a counselor, an administrator, a teacher, whoever it might be, all members of the support team have a specific sign that's hanging on their door that signifies that they are a member of that support team. So if a student is unsure of where to turn in any given moment, there is literally a sign pointing them in the right direction. So we need to equip all faculty. Again, this isn't just for the teachers and the counselors. This is for custodial staff. This is for the food services. This is for the administrators, right? All staff need to know of the resources that are available, as well as the parents and students, knowing where those supports are as well. And then it can become a matter of culture building. building a culture of health and wellness in your school. We know that our young people go to school with the intent of growing in their cognition and academic skill, right? But we also know that those things aren't possible if there isn't a component of personal wellness. So it's this idea of, can we start to build this culture of not only do we care for our young people academically, but we care for our young people holistically as well, right? And as faith-based schools, each of you are already well on that path, right? You are all aware it's not just about building up our young people in this one dynamic of their academics. It's also about building them up in faithful ways. It's also about building them up in personal wellness. And this is what I just hinted at. Connect, right? Growth and development of all kinds, whether that's cognitive, spiritual, or relational. All the growth occurs best in the presence of secure relationships. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's so important. All growth occurs best in the presence of secure relationships. So when we're talking about equipping staff and students, when we're talking about equipping parents, when we're talking about making these referral forms available or hanging door signs for the support team, whatever it may be, I really do understand that there is a sense of like, man, that feels like a lot of work to do. But the purpose is that we can then better connect with one another. We can then better connect with our students, and growth occurs best when there's those secure relationships. And if students know where to turn when they're struggling, they will. That is one piece of insecurity that they don't have to feel. They don't have to wonder, where will I go? They can know. I can go to any of the staff that have this door sign. And here's the good news. If there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 staff that have these support team signs, a student can find someone that they already connect with. A student can find a staff member that they are already comfortable with. And it's not whittled down to just that one option. Again, the work is not meant to be done alone. So if we can provide our students and young people with secure relationships, then we can help to build on a healthy foundation their cognitive development, their spiritual development, their relational development, and their personal development as well. These numbers, just something I think it's important for all of us to have. These are only will only apply to folks in the United States, but again, it's just a starting place. I would highly encourage you, for several reasons, to become aware of the resources in your local community, local mental health agencies, the local crisis agencies that are in your area, whether they be through health systems or through county networks or whatever it is. But these numbers are a good place to start, right? The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. In some places in the United States, it's already functioning, but they're hoping that it will be functioning everywhere by July of this year. 988 is the new suicide, or will be the new suicide prevention lifeline. And then especially for our young people, again, this applies in the United States, especially for our young people, a text line, simply texting the word help to 741-741. And their research tells them that young people are more likely to text for help than they are to call for help, to make a phone call. So again, these are just simple resources that we all ought to be aware of, and that we can make our young people aware of as well. So I know that was a lot of information and a lot of my voice. I think a few more things may have come in the chat, but I also want to just kind of open the floor here to see if there are any further questions. So I'll just shut my mouth here for a second. And if other stuff has come up in the chat that I didn't see, Michelle, or if there are other questions that any of you have that you'd like to lift up, we got some time.
Does anyone have any questions? You can use the reaction feature to raise your hand, or just speak out.
Doesn't look like there are questions.
No, I guess just lots of wonderful information to absorb and think about. So one last call for questions.
One question did actually just come in directly to me. The question was asked, when should hospitalization be considered? That's a really good question. There is a degree to which we need to use some of our own tact and understanding in this. But the sort of the language that exists out there is when that person is an imminent threat to themselves or somebody else. And so it's that idea of there being an imminent threat, as in this person, you know, whether it be through their behavior, or sometimes people will express, you know, this isn't something that I'm not going to make it home today, or I'm thinking about killing myself now, right? When that person is an imminent threat to themselves and there are not safe supports that can be provided, at that point, I would say hospitalization, I would say at that point, it's when we start to look down the road of hospitalization. It's something that we need to be aware of and sort of have in our quiver of tools, but it is, I don't like to use the word last resort just because I think it doesn't sound right, but it's sort of that last resort in that place of this person is in imminent danger of hurting themselves.
Yeah, I'll echo that and add to it that I think I think we need to use hospitalization when it makes sense, and it's good to not do this alone. So Ed has echoed that repeatedly, because we need people to bounce off of, you know, what do you think? Including the suicide prevention hotline. They also are happy to be a resource for people who are working with a suicidal person. It's not just for people who are ideating about suicide, but if you have a question about how serious the situation is, they're happy to think that through with you. I think the thing we need to be careful about in schools is that if we use that hospitalization piece too prematurely or too frequently, it can have the risk of making the whole system a little less safe, because kids are going to learn that when they're honest about their suicidality, they get hospitalized. And so they shut down, they stop being honest, they start closing off. So we need to use it effectively and efficiently when it is appropriate, but having a group of people who are trained in suicide prevention, who know how to do safety planning, and those kinds of things can help you keep that reserved for the cases that just need it. And I think that keeps the whole system healthier. Yeah.
So yeah, did that possibly spark an additional question? Or did someone think in this time of a question that they'd like to ask before we end? Okay, well, thank you so much, Michelle and Ed, for bringing all of this wonderful information to us. We so appreciate that the conversation about suicide and suicide prevention is grounded in faith and gospel values and spiritual practices. Thanks for bringing in the person of Jesus and all his struggles. We value what we've learned about the experience of thinking about suicide and suicidal ideation and its impact. Appreciate removing the stigma and those types of things. And the recommendation that will certainly stay with me, to yield to the youth, to really stop and listen. We appreciate having a better understanding of what suicide is and what it's not, and what we can do about it, and how we can become more aware of the resources within our building and within the community. And just that idea that this work can't be done alone, and we need as many, we need that community to really make the biggest impact, and also building that culture of well-being and secure relationships within our schools. I do believe that that is a hallmark of our Mercy schools, that certainly we can all always be better. So we appreciate that reminding of those. So thank you so much for all of this. And thank you to our participants. We will be following up with the slide deck, with a recording of the session that could be utilized in some further professional development within your community. And then also Soul Shop will be providing us with a model school policy from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And then we will also be providing you some additional resources on other programming that Soul Shop can offer to your individual schools. So all of that to come. And again, thank you all for being here, and everyone have a blessed and holy Easter and a good restful break, and continue to stay safe and healthy.